Hello everyone, Jacob from Bryn Mawr Film Institute here. Our film this week is The Magnificent Ambersons from 1942, the second feature film directed by Orson Welles. We'll be discussing this film at 6:30 p.m. on Monday, June 22nd. To learn more about this and other film studies opportunities, please visit us on the web at brynmawrfilm.org. So let's talk about The Magnificent Ambersons. This is a film that occupies a sort of curious position in film history. On one hand, it is widely viewed as a classic and a major work by a significant filmmaker. On the other hand, it is one of the most famous examples of a studio tampering with a film over the objections of its director. And so, to understand what happened to The Magnificent Ambersons and why, it's useful to know a bit about where things stood for Orson Welles in 1942. Now, Welles was a young man when he made this film. He was only 26 years old, but he had already established himself as this sort of polymathic prodigy. And in the years previous, he had already done groundbreaking work on the stage, in radio, and in cinema. His rise had really culminated in 1941 with the release of his first feature film, which was, of course, Citizen Kane, made for RKO Pictures. Now, critics had liked Citizen Kane, mostly. Many even recognized it as a landmark achievement. But the film did not do well at the box office. It did not even recoup its budget. And so as Welles began to lay the groundwork for his next project at RKO, the studio still had faith in his vision, and they were still willing to commit resources to him. But given the financial failure of Citizen Kane and other money troubles at the studio, they were also desperate for a hit. Now, Welles had been interested in doing something with Booth Tarkington's 1918 novel, The Magnificent Ambersons, for some time. In fact, a few years earlier, he had adapted it into an hour-long radio drama. And RKO liked the idea of this becoming his next feature film. After all, the story included many of the elements that Hollywood studios like to see. It was based on a popular book. It was a family epic with a rise and fall arc. It also featured a tragic romance and a sort of spiritual awakening. All very promising elements. The film's problems really began in post-production. Once principal shooting had been concluded, various obligations brought Welles south to Rio de Janeiro to start work on a documentary film called It's All True. The film would never be finished. From Rio de Janeiro, Welles edited the film remotely, communicating by cable with his editor, Robert Wise, who was still in the United States. And together they put together a version of the film that came to 134 minutes. Now, initially, RKO was very pleased with the film, and this was the version that played at its first two preview screenings in California. The preview audience, however, was not so pleased with the film. In fact, they did not like it at all, and found it too arty, too solemn, and too slow. And so RKO, desperate for their hit, began to reshape the film, and they excluded Welles from the process. This was easy to do, him being in South America and everything. So when all was said and done, they trimmed 45 minutes from the runtime. They added several new scenes that were shot without Welles's participation, and most notably this included a new ending, which wrapped up the film with a sort of sunnier note. The ironic thing about all of this was these measures did not turn The Magnificent Ambersons into a kind of commercially palatable hit. Rather, The Magnificent Ambersons was released to the sort of same reception as Citizen Kane. It was critically well received. In fact, it was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. But like Citizen Kane, it did not recoup its budget. And this would be among several factors that would eventually lead to Welles's firing from RKO. And so today we know The Magnificent Ambersons as this sort of famously compromised project. But I don't think we should let that legacy hang over what we do have too much, because the version of Ambersons that is with us is still a really affecting and powerful film with a lot of virtues. There are some knockout performances, particularly from Joseph Cotten and Agnes Moorehead, who would be nominated for an Academy Award. She plays Fanny Minifer. This is also a formally dazzling movie, and we see many of the techniques that Welles is famous for. We'll see these long, extended, gliding tracking shots with the camera sweeping through the Amberson mansion. We'll see Welles using this sort of expressionistic light with heavy shadow and high contrast brightness. We'll also see the sort of elaborate, deep focus scene stagings that encompass sort of vast ranges of people and conversations in action. The Magnificent Ambersons is also one of the most thoughtful films that I've seen, at least, about living through changing times. The film takes place over a period of several decades, beginning somewhere around 1885 and ending in the early 19-teens, a few years before World War I. And this is a period during which America undergoes some significant changes. During this time, we see the advent of industrialization and urbanization. We start to see the displacement of the sort of old money aristocracy by a kind of new money business class. And with all of this, there's this sort of general acceleration of the pace of life. Now, interestingly, The Magnificent Ambersons was one of several films released during the 1940s that are set during this period of American history. Some of the other films from that cycle include The Strawberry Blonde from 1941, directed by Raoul Walsh. Most famously, Meet Me in St. Louis, directed by Vincent Minnelli in 1944, and Otto Preminger's Centennial Summer, released in 1946. And these films mainly offered a sort of nostalgic escapism, this sort of vision of this older, quainter America. And, for a wartime and immediate post-war audience, one could see the appeal of that sort of escapist nostalgia. Ambersons, by contrast, takes a much more ambivalent tone. It's focused less on a sort of nostalgic return to the past, and more on the way that time marches forward, and the way that progress, as it were, sometimes leaves people behind. As Booth Tarkington writes in his novel, quote, "The things we have had that we think are so solid, they're like smoke, and time is like the sky that smoke disappears into." The Magnificent Ambersons is available on most rent-to-stream platforms. I hope you'll check out the film, and I look forward to talking about it with you during our discussion.